Good morning to all of you. As always, it's such a pleasure to be here. And this morning we're going to talk about the topic teaching by example. Probably everyone here is familiar with this famous quotation, commonly attributed to the Mahatma Gandhi. It tells us to be the change that we want to see in the world. And this advice fits perfectly in line with the moral guidance that we find in Spiritism. It's almost like a variation on the Golden Rule. There are, of course, different aspects to this instruction. For example, when we look at the world around us and we see all of the changes that we would like to find happening, obviously, one person alone cannot single-handedly make that happen. But that to the degree that each of us strives to do our part, then collectively and over time, we will bring about all these changes that Spiritism tells us our planet is destined to achieve. In fact, one of the many ways that Spiritism brings us consolation is by teaching us that all of our hardships and pains and difficulties and struggles, they're only temporary. But they're not temporary merely because the time that we spend here is only in passing, but also because our planet, the Earth itself, is also undergoing an evolutionary process. And this is a place that we may very likely return to inhabit again someday. As part of this evolution, the Earth will prosper from all of the efforts that people make generation after generation as they strive to make it a better place to live. And so Spiritism tells us that a time will come when the earth will be reserved for the incarnation of souls who've demonstrated a minimum degree of willingness to exercise tolerance, respect, simplicity, solidarity, and the like. So Spiritism says, don't worry that you cannot change the whole world. It's not all on your shoulders. And there is a power that's higher and greater than any living being. Do not despair, Spiritism says. Just go out into the world and do what you can each day to bring love and to serve. You don't ever have to feel that your efforts, your sacrifices, or your tears are in vain. Never give up and have faith that God, who knows what is best, will take care of you and of this world. A similar aspect of this advice is the fact that if all we do is complain about humanity's sufferings and failures and weaknesses, but we do nothing to promote improvement or to offer solace to those in need, then what makes us think that the responsibility for doing all those things and bringing about all those changes that we want to see lies only in the hands of those other people? And by what merit may we claim the right to inhabit this better world to come? Well, contrary to the idea that a mere profession of faith will guarantee us happiness and peace in a future life or in this afterlife to come, Spiritism teaches us that our actions and our choices, and consequently our evaluation of those choices made by our conscience, these are the measures that will determine what we're going to experience in the immediate afterlife and beyond. So in the Gospel According to Spiritism, in a chapter entitled, "Many are called, but few are chosen," Allan Kardec comments on the biblical parable of the wedding feast. And he says, it's not enough simply to be invited. It's not enough to simply take the name Christian, nor to sit at the table and take part in the heavenly banquet. Before anything else, and as an express condition, it is necessary to be dressed in the wedding garment. Which means what? He says this means to have a pure heart and to practice the law according to spirit. And of course, this is the law of love and charity. Kardec says how few make themselves worthy to enter the kingdom of heaven. This is why, he says, Jesus proclaimed that many will be called, but few will be chosen. Now, aside from actively doing our part to make a positive difference in the world by touching the lives of those around us, and by doing so, naturally making the efforts that will result in our moral transformation, there's another important idea or message wrapped up in this inspirational statement, and it has to do with the power of example. And that's what we're here to talk about this morning. In fact, we are specifically going to talk about teaching by example. Sometimes this is a desire that we have, and other times it's a duty. But quite often, this kind of calling involves a combination of both. The desire to teach others what we know, what we believe, what inspires, and what comforts us is often motivated by a strong enthusiasm for the way that some kind of knowledge, learning, moral principle, or ideal has served us in our own life, and a good-hearted aspiration to bring that same benefit to others. Now, within the setting of today's discussion, we can talk about how this yearning to teach and to share can be very strong with respect to things like moral ideals, or an awareness about the meaning and the purpose of our lives as eternal spirits. There's also many new perspectives that we gain with this kind of knowledge. And we can even sometimes feel frustrated, right? When we feel that somebody's missing out on this. It's all so inspirational. We wish everyone could see things the same way. At least I've felt that way. But it's really not realistic to think that everyone will hear the things we have to share and find in them the same resolution and inspiration that we do. It's also not right to want to impose our beliefs on others, just as we don't want them to impose their ideas on us. And this is something that Kardec stated so eloquently in the Gospel According to Spiritism. He tells us, this is what Spiritism tells its adherents today. Do not violate anyone's conscience. Do not force anyone to leave his or her own beliefs to adopt yours. Do not cast an anathema on those who do not think like you. Gather those who come to you and leave in peace those who reject you. Remember Christ's words. He says, formerly, heaven was taken by force, but today it's taken by kindness. Alongside the desire to teach, as I mentioned before, is also the duty to do so. And this is something that is particularly inherent to certain roles and relationships that are a part of our lives. When it comes to teaching by example, this duty also involves our acknowledgement that we don't live and act in a vacuum. So at any moment, we have the potential to influence others for better or for worse through our examples. Now, when we recognize this responsibility, how can we be assured that we are setting positive examples, that we are influencing others in a positive way? Or when we feel this enthusiasm to share what we believe, how can we know that we are not violating anyone's conscience? What can we do with that enthusiasm without violating someone's free will? Well, the first thing that we can do is start applying that wisdom to ourselves. Because if we're not careful with our pride, then we can quickly and easily make our knowledge a baseline for measuring the actions of others instead of focusing on our own. Now, items 9 and 10 of chapter 5 in the Gospel according to Spiritism invite us to reflect on this passage from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Can anyone here in this room deny that it's much easier to observe the conduct of other individuals rather than looking inside ourselves and really analyzing our own behaviors? And yet it is looking in the mirror that is precisely what Kardec says we need to do. Kardec says we need to ask ourselves, what would I do if I saw someone else doing what I'm doing? And this is not just how would I judge my own conduct, but also, am I the kind of person that I would want as a friend? Am I the kind of person that I would perceive with credibility or look at as a role model or example in some way? Well, once we take a step back from our judgment of others and we instead take a good look at our own behaviors, then if we're also out there hoping to persuade others to see things the way we do, then we've got to take a good look at the degree to which we are walking the talk, right? And it's like this familiar saying goes, actions speak louder than words. So at the end of the day, it's not about the good counsel we may give as trusted advisors, or the inspirational words that we may share, maybe in a public talk or a private conversation, or all these great and inspiring quotes that we like to post and share on Facebook and other social media. If our actions are not in line with the words that we share, verbally or otherwise. So how about when it comes to the dissemination of Spiritism? As we talk about that enthusiasm that we have to share the Spiritist teachings, how important is it that we be aware of our integrity? I think that it's really nothing short of crucial. Now, of course, nobody panic, we are not perfect. We cannot demand perfection neither of ourselves or others, because we're all here learning and growing. But we need to at least realize how our actions and behaviors influence others. And the fact that if we tell others that Spiritism offers something different, but by our actions we look like more of the same, we're hardly going to be convincing. And I recently found an article on the CBS News website. It's called "Losing Our Religion." The article states that according to this study done by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, our nation's landscape is becoming a little less religious, and that some 45 million people, or 1/5 of the U.S. adult population, no longer say that they belong to any church in particular. And the individuals who check that none box when they're asked to describe their religious affiliation, that group has more than doubled since 1990. Now, as commented by the senior researcher in this study, who was quoted in the article, being unaffiliated isn't necessarily the same thing as not having faith. And this is also something that was pointed out in the evidence from this research. As questioned then by the article's author, if it's not God or the thought of a higher power that's turning people off, what is? And he says that this study reports of respondents overwhelmingly saying that many organizations are too focused on money, power, and politics. Well, while we acknowledge that there are many reasons why people are looking for something different, there are theological, philosophical, social, many reasons. But still, this kind of feedback, on one hand, illustrates a great potential that we have in Spiritism to offer an oasis to the disillusioned, not only by sharing new ideas in terms of spiritual teachings, but also by demonstrating their influence in practice. And this study also presents us with a significant warning that if we as Spiritists should fail to distinguish ourselves and exemplify the benefit that we perceive to be the Spiritist perspective, then we too risk failing to hold the interest of those who are seeking the truth in both theory and practice. Now, in mentioning this article, by no means do I wish to imply that the exemplification of Spiritist principles in the interest of disseminating Spiritism is limited to the ways that we run our centers in our organizations. It truly comes down to whether or not people observe that the kind of lessons attributed to the teachings of the spirits and that they themselves find in the books from Kardec and others are reflected in the words and actions of those of us who claim them to be so powerful. And I think it's likely that for this reason, the Spirit Emmanuel referred to our example as a form of charity by which we're called to share the Spiritist message. And coincidentally, I found that affirmation from him one day when I was looking for another quote commonly attributed to this spiritual benefactor. On numerous occasions, I've heard Emmanuel quoted as saying that the greatest form of charity we can do and benefit of Spiritism is its dissemination. The greatest form of charity we can do and benefit of Spiritism is its dissemination. So one day I was curious to find the text where that was written, because I wanted to understand Emmanuel's message behind those words and the context. In other words, by dissemination, would he mean those lectures and all of our books, or is it something else? I even heard him quoted as saying that the greatest form of charity we can do is the dissemination of Spiritism. So I really wanted to understand what he was saying. I searched online and I came across numerous mentions of this quote, but never accompanied by a cited source. So if anyone can point me to that, I would really appreciate it. But in the meantime, I came across a different article by a Spiritist named Francisco Rebosas, where he wrote about his own search for that quote from Emmanuel. And he said that he hasn't found it yet either, but he did find something interesting in a book called Estudie e Viva, or Study and Live. It's not yet in English, where Emmanuel writes this. He says, "Remember them, those nearly mad with suffering, and work so that the Spiritist doctrine may extend them the help they need. And to that end, let us study Allan Kardec under the light of Jesus' message, and whether it be in our example or our attitude, our actions or our words, let us remember that Spiritism asks us for a permanent kind of charity, the charity of its very dissemination." And I have to agree with this writer, Rebosas, and his conclusion that in his belief, it is in the observance and practice of its teachings where we find the grand objective that Spiritism holds for its sincere follower. All of this is echoed, or actually echoes, we should say, the insight found in the answer to question number 842 of the Spirits book from Allan Kardec, which asks, "Since all doctrines claim to be the sole expression of the truth, by what signs can we recognize which one actually has the right to be presented as such?" And isn't this what so many people are asking themselves today? There's so many religions, so many philosophies and belief systems. How do we know which one is right? Which one will prove to be true? And the Spirits replied, "It'll be the one that produces the fewest hypocrites and the greatest number of moral individuals, which means they practice the law of love and charity in its greatest purity and its widest application. By this sign you will recognize which doctrine is good, because those that result in sowing disunion and establishing division among God's children can only be erroneous and harmful." So you see, the Spirits didn't point to any particular belief system. They simply pointed to the demonstrated moral impact that those beliefs may have on any individuals who ascribe to them. So what all of this boils down to is the recognition that our day-to-day behaviors, the ways that we treat ourselves and others, have consequences. Now, quite often we talk about those consequences in terms of, for example, the law of action and reaction, and what that means for our own future. But there are also these consequences because we never know just who amongst our clouds of witnesses, both incarnate and discarnate witnesses, by the way, just who is keenly observing us and taking in our examples, good or bad. And this is true whether we're talking about a great number of individuals or someone in particular, maybe a friend, a family member, or acquaintance, even strangers. It's also true whether we're talking about sharing Spiritism per se, or simply and genuinely wishing to help someone with what we perceive to be better choices. especially when that person may not be willing, for whatever reason, to hear what we might want to share. So the opportunities to set good examples are innumerable. For example, it might be an act of kindness or the simple readiness to help someone else in need, a demonstration of tolerance or forgiveness, a display of humility when in a position of leadership or of instructing others. Could be the expression of gratitude, especially the outward recognition of a blessing in disguise. The commitment to pray for someone undergoing some kind of struggle. The language and tone that we use when we speak, the conversations that we participate in, and even those that we avoid or refuse to join in. It could be whether or not we treat others as equals, how we choose to use our time and resources, what we're showing to give value to. Or how about the manner in which we handle life's conflicts, upsets, or misfortunes? If we have a negative or positive approach to life. This could also be how we react to the disincarnation of loved ones. It might be the degree to which we consider the needs and feelings of others, or how we take care of ourselves and work on improving ourselves. But let us also remember that in the same way, our poor examples are also witnessed. And sometimes, we might want to pull out that familiar expression, do as I say, not as I do. But in reality, that's not the way it works. And this is something important to keep in mind, because we will, in some way, be responsible for our conduct that even by example might lead others astray. Now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk more specifically about a particular role in life where teaching by example is, without a doubt, a serious responsibility. Maybe all of you have already guessed what that might be, but it is when we are responsible for or have an influential part in raising a child. We all know that children are impressionable and that they tend to mimic, repeat, and even adopt the ways and behaviors of their role models. So the examples we set are very important. And in the Spirit's book, question number 383, we find this question: what is the usefulness of a spirit having to go through childhood? The Spirit's answer: a spirit incarnates in order to perfect itself. During childhood, it is more accessible to the impression it receives, which may assist in its progress. Persons in charge of its education should contribute toward this goal. I think everybody can understand that it is important that we contribute to the progress of a child. But when we begin to understand about that child's spirit and the spirit's road to progress, including especially reincarnation and the meaning of this return to the physical life, what that's all about, we see how Spiritism adds an even greater sense of purpose and accountability to the role of raising a child. So I'd like to read to you another excerpt from the Spirit's answer to question 385, where they tell us, ponder the possibility that the child born among you may have come from a world on which it acquired altogether different habits. How would you want this child to remain in your midst with passions so diverse from yours, inclinations and tastes entirely opposite to yours? How would you want it to incorporate itself into your environment except in the way God wanted it to, That is, after having experienced the sieve of childhood. And I really thought that that was a great use of words, the sieve of childhood. And we don't have to consider the Spirit coming from another world, physically speaking, for this to be important, because it can be another time. The Spirit will inevitably have a history of prior incarnations and will therefore bring with it certain tendencies and inclinations. And so the spirits go on to explain in the same answer that childhood provides yet another purpose, that spirits only enter the corporeal life in order to improve and purify themselves. The fragility of the early years renders them flexible and accessible to the counsels of experience and to those who should aid in their progress. They say, that is the time when one can best reform their character and curb their inferior tendencies. Such is the duty that God entrusts to parents, a sacred mission for which they will have to answer. And so it sounds pretty serious, right? Indeed, it is a very important responsibility. Now, although for many reasons, the task of instilling in our children a sense of ethics and morality has increasingly been pushed onto schools and teachers, the true place where this should be happening first and foremost is where? In the home. In fact, out of all the places that life takes us to teach us important lessons, the home is the first classroom. Well, fortunately, the opportunities for teaching by example that I mentioned a little earlier, they're also applicable with our children, with the caveat that with these young minds soaking up information like sponges, as they no doubt watch our every move very carefully, I think that this example should be accompanied by dialogue. And the dialogue will serve to stimulate the children's thought processes, to aid in their interpretation of what they experience or even what they witness. And it will help them to have the understanding and the motivation to do the same things when life presents the opportunity, because we share with them the meaning and the intent behind the positive things that we do. Perhaps some of you know how powerful this is simply by reflecting on how you might have observed and followed the lead of your own parents or other caregivers. And I personally am extremely grateful for the positive examples that my parents set for me. But to this day, I like to comment that now, thanks to Spiritism, I'm working on developing certain behaviors or qualities that I have an even greater appreciation for. And yet I can't help but reflect on how they come naturally to the two of my parents. And they still inspire me. So I think that no matter how old you are or your children are, you can still be a role model for them. Because in life, we really never stop learning, do we? I'd like to share with you all a poem that perhaps some of you have heard or read before. It's called Children Learn What They Live. It was written by a woman named Dorothy Law Nolte in 1954 to fill a weekly newspaper advice column. And later in 1998, she expanded that poem into an entire book, where she devotes a chapter to each line in the poem. And with the success of that poem and book, she wrote another one called Teenagers Learn What They Live, which might also be very interesting for those interested. But this poem really exemplifies how children learn from our examples. So I thought it would be nice to share it with you. And it goes like this. If children live with criticism, they learn to condemn. with hostility to fight, with fear to be apprehensive, with pity to feel sorry for themselves. If children live with ridicule, they learn to feel shy, jealousy, envy, shame, to feel guilty. But if children live with encouragement, they learn confidence, with tolerance, patience. You are thus responsible not only for what you do, but also for what your ideas and attitudes inspire in other individuals. Dictators and domineering people by themselves would never accomplish anything were it not for those who think like they do and support them. By the same token, good works would disappear if it were not for people who identify with them through sacrifice and love. And so she says, be careful what you say and do. Encourage followers to elevate themselves and to act accordingly. And so we go back to this message to be the light of the world.